Praise be to God. Today's Bible reading portion is taken from a new book, that is Leviticus chapter 1 to 5. We had been seeing the last 10 chapters in the past week from the book of Exodus, and now in Leviticus it picks up from where Exodus has left off. In chapter 1, we can see that the children of Israel are now on their way through the wilderness to the Canaan land. We had seen on how God instructed Moses on different laws and instructions that he gave to the people of Israel in the book of Exodus. Now in Leviticus, he talks about a lot of sacrifices that has to be done by the people of Israel. In chapter 1 verses 1 and 2, God instructs Moses on burnt sacrifices. Now God called Moses to the tabernacle, which is the tent of meeting, and gave him instructions for how the Israelites were supposed to offer sacrifices. They could either bring an offering from their herd or from their flock. Verses 3 to 9, it talks on the instructions for offering oxen. Now, if an Israelite wanted to offer an ox to the Lord, he was to bring a male ox without blemish to the entrance of the tabernacle. After placing his hand on the ox's head, the sacrificer was to kill the ox. The priests were to take the blood and throw it against the bronze altar. Then, the one offering the animal was to skin it and cut it in pieces. After washing the entrails and the legs, the pieces were to be arranged on the wood on the altar and burnt. These offerings went up to heaven as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Verses 10 to 13, it says on how an Israelite man wanted to offer a goat or a sheep. He was to bring the animal to the tabernacle, kill it on the north side of the bronze altar. Again, the priests were to take the blood and throw it against the sides of the altar. The animal was then to be chopped into pieces, and after its legs and entrails were washed, burnt with wood on the altar as a food offering, pleasing aroma to the Lord. Verses 14 to 17, in addition to goats, sheep, and oxen, the Israelites could even offer turtle doves and pigeons. Now, if a bird offering was brought to the priests were to wring off the bird's head and drain its blood on the side of the altar. The priest was then to tear the bird open by its wing and burn it on the altar as a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. In chapter 2, we can see how the priests were partially provided for through the offerings the people brought to the tabernacle. The part of the things dedicated to the Lord were also allotted to them, to those who serve the Lord, that is, the priests. In chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, we can see the different types of grain offerings being done by the Israelites. Now, God specified the way these grain offerings were to be prepared, depending on the way the grain was cooked. When the person offering the sacrifice had prepared the grain, they were to bring it to the tabernacle and give it to the priest. The priests offered a portion of it to the Lord by burning it on the altar as a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. And if a grain offering was offered as an offering of first fruits, that is a special kind of food offering, it was to consist of fresh grains that was crushed and roasted with fire. And oil and frankincense were to be put on it before handing it over to the priest to be offered. Now, when we see in chapter 3, along with this, we can see some of the offerings that had been made by the Israelites. Now we can see the peace offerings made with animals from the herd. In the previous chapters, now we have discussed about the burnt offerings and grain offerings. In Leviticus chapter 3, we are introduced to peace offerings. Now, if an Israelite wanted to offer a peace offering using an animal from his cattle, he was to bring a male or female without blemish to the tabernacle. Verses 6 to 11. If an Israelite man brought a lamb to be sacrificed as a peace offering, the same procedures were to be followed, with the exception that slightly different portions were to be burnt on the altar. Verses 12 to 6. If an Israelite man brought a goat to be sacrificed as a peace offering, he was to bring the animal to the tabernacle and lay his hand on its head before killing it. Verses 17. The Israelites were now forbidden to eat fat and blood. In chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, it says that all fat is the Lord's. So it was not an offering made as an attempt to make peace with God after sinning, but rather it was an offering of praise or thanksgiving for having peace with God. That brings us end to the chapter 3 in Leviticus. In chapter 4, it introduces some kind of offerings for the anointed priests. So far, we had seen on how the Israelites were ordered to be bringing offerings. Now, we go into on how the priests can bring their offerings. In chapter 4, verses 1 to 2, and going forward until 12, if one of the anointed priests was sinned, he was to bring a bull without blemish as an offering to the tabernacle. He was to lay his hand on the bull's head and kill it. The priest was to take some of the bull's blood and sprinkle it 7 times in front. Verses 13 to 21, it talks about the offering for the congregation of Israel. Now, if the whole nation of Israel sinned and later realized their guilt, they were to bring a bull to the entrance of the tabernacle. Then the elders of Israel were to place their hands on the heads of the bull before killing it. Verses 22 to 26 talks on the sin offerings for the leaders of Israel. Now, if a leader had sinned, he was to bring a male goat without blemish to the tabernacle. The priest was to dip his finger in some of the goat's blood and put it on the horns of the bronze altar. In chapter 4, verses from 27 to 35, it is the offerings for the common people. If an Israelite citizen sinned, he was to bring either a female goat or a female lamb without blemish to be sacrificed, and the same procedures were to be followed on how it was prescribed for the peace offerings. Moving to chapter 5, now it talks about the sin offerings and the options for the poor. Verses starting from 1 to 13, it says, if an Israelite sinned by not testifying to a crime he witnessed, unknowingly touching something unclean, or by speaking a rash or reckless oath when he realized his guilt, he was to bring a female goat or lamb to the priest as a sin offering. If he didn't find a goat or lamb, he was to give a sacrifice of pigeons or turtle doves. In the case if the man couldn't find or afford 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, he was to bring a tenth of an ephod of fine flour for his sin offering. And this flour, it was not to include any oil or frankincense because it was a sin offering. Now, the priest was to sacrifice a handful of the flour on the altar, and the remainder of the flour was to be kept by the priest. In chapter 5, verses 14 to 19, now if a man commits any kind of breach of faith and sin unintentionally in any of the holy things of the Lord, he was to bring a ram to the tabernacle as guilt offerings. Now the last part of chapter 5 talks about the laws for guilt offerings. He was also to make restitution for his mistakes and add a fifth to the total. Again, the priest would make atonement for him and he would be forgiven. This concludes chapter 5 on how the Lord alters the different laws and sacrifices in different types of offerings, such as guilt offerings, sin offerings, and peace offerings. And I hope God speaks to each one of you all. Thank you again for listening, and God bless.